place on Saturday in central London in what the Met say could be one of the busiest days for them in recent years. They have put in some particular measures around the annual pro-Palestine Nakba Day march, and there is a separate march, Unite the Kingdom march as it's called, organised by Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, better known as you know as Tommy Robinson, that'll gather in Parliament Square. And there are particular conditions around both, slightly different as well. We can go into that in a bit more detail. But earlier on this afternoon, Sir Keir Starmer posted this video about the Unite the Kingdom march.
Tomorrow's march in London is a reminder of what we're up against in the battle of our values. The organisers, including convicted thugs and racists, are peddling hatred and division, plain and simple. Their goal is to convince people that Britain's problems are caused by those living alongside them. But that is not the Britain that I know. This is a country built on decency, fairness and respect. A country that is at its best when people from different backgrounds come together in common purpose. This is our country, with a majority who share those values, a majority who may not always be as loud, but must always define who we are. So, my government will not stand in the way of peaceful protest. But we will act decisively against hatred. We will use the full force of the law when that hatred manifests as violence. And we will ban those coming into the UK who seek to stir it up, as we have done already. Because this country belongs to all of us. And I will not tolerate anyone who seeks to stand in the way of that.
Well, there are 7 people who've been barred from travelling into the UK from abroad, just to give a bit of detail on some of what the Prime Minister said there. Public Order Act conditions are being imposed on both marches, and live facial recognition is going to be used for the first time as part of a protest policing operation. It's expected to cost this operation combined around £4.5 million, coincides with the FA Cup final as well at Wembley, against the backdrop of a terrorism threat level that remains at severe. Face recognition will be used. There will be other kinds of restrictions placed on individual organisers of the events as well, should things go south, so to speak. Joe Mulhall joins me, Director of Research at Hope Not Hate, an organisation which campaigns against racism and fascism. Do you have any concerns about the measures that have been imposed on either of these marches?
No, I mean, understandably, there's going to be a huge amount of people in central London, and there's understandable concern about these two opposing demonstrations and the possibility for sort of clashes, although I would argue that they're very, very different types of protests. And I think it's actually been really welcome seeing the government banning, I think it's now actually up to 11 foreign speakers that have been due to attend at the Tommy Robinson march tomorrow, and I think it's been really, really welcome. We've seen many of the individuals who have been refused entry this time around were at the previous Tommy Robinson demonstration last year and delivered some really horrifyingly extreme speeches. And I think the Prime Minister is absolutely right that while freedom of speech is fundamental and important and people have the right to protest, it doesn't necessarily mean that the government have to allow in such extreme figures to whip up hatred on the streets of London.
As I mentioned, some dispersal orders are in place, Section 60 and Section 60 AA powers, which cover search and removal of face coverings. Facial recognition is being used, deployed in Camden, in an area likely to be used by those attending Unite the Kingdom. Are there some sensitivities around the fact that facial recognition will be used in one protest but not the other?
I can understand why people are perhaps conflating these two demonstrations in the sense that they're on the same day, but I think it's important to, one is an explicitly far-right protest, right? The Tommy Robinson demonstration, we've seen this time and time again, is organised by a well-known far-right figure. It's being attended by huge amounts of very extreme and well-known far-right figures, and we saw last time from the stage quite how dangerous and extreme the rhetoric from the stage has been. And we also saw, let's not forget how many times Tommy Robinson protests have erupted in real violence. And, we saw a large number of arrests and police officers being hurt even just at the last Tommy Robinson protest, let alone the last 15, 16 years of events that he's organised that have very regularly spilt out into really nasty violence on the streets of this country. So I think it makes it's completely understandable that the police would want to take extra steps for a protest that's been organised like this by an individual with a track record like his.
There are typically a great deal of faces covered in lots of protests these days, but that very much includes the pro-Palestinian protests as well, doesn't it? I mean, it's a sort of mark of some of the sort of most vocal activists there that there's a face covering, particularly in the men. So it does seem a bit... You can see how people would look at that and think, that's odd. Why, if we're facially recognising with equipment the Unite the Kingdom march, but we're not with the other one, and we're letting people do that march in masks, and there will be sections of the community in this country, perhaps especially the Jewish community, who look at those pro-Palestinian marches and feel every bit as nervous as somebody else watching the Unite the Kingdom march.
I completely understand a lot of the concerns that have been voiced by the Jewish community and well beyond that in terms of some of the racism that we've seen on pro-Palestinian marches over the last few years that has been completely unacceptable. And I think the face mask, covering one's face is a complex issue, right? There's a whole range of reasons why people have traditionally covered their faces, and often you would get progressive or left-wing activists that were concerned about state oppression or institutionalised racism or institutionalised homophobia in the police or misogyny that felt they wanted to be able to exert their democratic right to protest while also protecting their own identities. And there's a long tradition of that. But I think, again,
well, I'm just challenging you a bit here.
Well, yeah, I think there is a difference between that and someone covering their face so that they can engage in violence.
Well, but there'll be people on that march, the Unite the Kingdom march. I heard a gentleman on, I think it was Nick's programme this week, saying he intends to go, and he's never been violent, has no intention of being violent. He just feels that he wants to go and express his support for his country, as he puts it, right? I'm just saying what he said. If he put a balaclava on, would that be a problem any more than somebody wearing a balaclava on a pro-Palestinian protest? I mean, there are allegations of two-tier policing around this.
Yeah, I mean, there are allegations of two-tier policing. I mean, what I would say, though, is while these protests are happening on the same day, and while there are concerns about racism that have been voiced on both of them, they are not the same protests, right? The Tommy Robinson protest is an explicitly far-right protest, organised by individuals with the purpose of expounding hateful politics, right? It's not a protest that has racism on it. It is a racist protest, organised by an individual with a track record of arrests and violence and criminality. It's being spoken to by individuals with a long track record of thuggery and violence, and in many cases very, very extreme rhetoric, and attended by individuals that I accept is, with the numbers being as large as they're likely to be, will be a broad range of individuals. But I would really encourage people to look back at the last Tommy Robinson protest last year, where we were seeing people in the crowd calling for the death of the Prime Minister, the banning of all non-Christian religious imagery, the mass deportation of non-white people. This is, when we talk about hate marches, this is an explicit one. Now, this is not, for a second, to downplay the fact that we've absolutely seen racism on pro-Palestinian marches, which is completely unacceptable and needs to be stamped out. But while these events are happening at the same time tomorrow, they're not necessarily, I would say, they're not two identical hate marches as some people are perhaps presenting it.
No, they're different in origin and different in motivation, but only one side gets to not have facial recognition pointed at them and still keep their face covered.
But as I've said, they're different protests attended by different types of people with different motives, so it's perhaps.
But you've also accepted that that's not always the case on one side.
Right, but fundamentally they are different protests attended by different people with different purposes. And so, I mean, either one can have a kind of a consistent position, which is all protests should be policed in the same manner, or one accepts that far-right protests are different to other protests that happen in this country because of the nature of what they are, what they believe, what they're espousing, and how they've behaved in the past.
Would you say that the Unite the Kingdom rally, often shorthand is the Tommy Robinson's rally, is how people describe it often, is a racist rally dressing up as a patriotic love of country rally?
Yeah, I think there's very little doubt about that. The Unite the Kingdom banner, if you will, has been around for some years now. Before that, Tommy Robinson had different movements, and prior to, in the early days, of course, it was the English Defence League. We know what these protests are. They've been happening for nearly 20 years, being led by Tommy Robinson. We know the rhetoric that comes from the stage. And actually, we were really shocked at Hope Not Hate in the last protest we saw last year, because the numbers were so vast. It was by some margin the largest ever far-right protest we've seen in the United Kingdom, with probably at least 150,000 people on them. And some of the rhetoric from the stage was more extreme than the rhetoric we would have heard back in the days of the English Defence League, in terms of this mass deportation, far-right figures talking about remigration, a well-known trope within far-right groups. To see such large audiences, and while, as I say, I accept that not everyone there will be far right, to see such enormous audiences standing in front of such extreme speeches has been really, really concerning.
Joe, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Joe Mulhall, Director of Research at Hope Not Hate, which campaigns against racism and fascism. We're going to talk more about this after the news at